If patterns hold, the 2022 midterm elections will offer a course correction after 2 years of the Biden presidency. Today's guest will help us assess the impact of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, the president's recent legislative successes, and whether changing conditions on America's southern border just might lead to some surprises in November. He's Jeremy Wallace this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludes from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University.
And I'm G. Wayne Miller with the Providence Journal.
This week we're joined by Jeremy Wallace, the lead state political reporter for the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News. He's also the co-host of the Texas Take podcast, and he's coming to us today from deep in the heart of Texas. Jeremy, thank you for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.
We want to spend some time talking with you about the issues in the 2022 electoral cycle, the midterm elections, both in Texas and nationally. But let's even take a step back from that. When did you start covering politics?
I've been covering politics since the early 1990s. I got my start at the San Antonio Light, which doesn't even exist anymore, which shows you how long I've been doing this. But I've been trolling around Texas for the last 5 years I've been here, but before that I was in Florida and did some time up in Washington, D.C., covering Congress, at one point writing for the Boston Globe. So I've been all around. I've been everywhere, man.
Were you a political junkie before you were a political journalist?
Absolutely. In 1984, I was, while other kids were watching cartoons, I was watching Mondale. It's like, what's he going to say next? So I was clearly a nerd who was going to be thrown out of the playground from day one.
So give us an overview of what's happening in terms of politics now in Texas. What is the big issue, the leading issue, both in terms of local elections and in terms of national elections from Texas?
Well, first of all, Texas politics has been changing so rapidly and so quickly. It's like what people think of Texas right now is very different than what is happening on the ground right now. Our voter registrations are off the charts. It's much more diverse and urbanizing than people probably realize outside of the state of Texas, even in the state of Texas. But the predominant issue still remains border security. That has become one of the issue that just keeps coming up number one in most polling. And you see it in both the campaigns. Governor Greg Abbott makes border security his predominant issue in almost everything he does. And even Beto O'Rourke has made, who's running for governor as a Democrat, he's made the border a big issue too. In Del Rio, he's assured folks that he will protect the border. He will also have troops on the border to kind of help protect. So you can see it's an issue on the minds of not just people away from the border, but directly on the border. There's all kinds of safety and security issues that people want answers to.
So bearing in mind that this will be broadcasting a couple of 3-4 weeks before the actual elections, where are O'Rourke and Abbott now in the polling, and what are the trends saying? I understand it's a fairly close race to the surprise of some people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in Texas, we're talking about a 4 or 5 point split in most of the public polling we're seeing, look, in Texas, polling is really difficult. One of the things we saw in 2018 is that no pollsters understood what was happening. They did not know who was coming out to vote. And everybody was shocked when the U.S. Senate race then was decided by less than 3 points. And so I think we're kind of in that same mode where these races are much closer now in Texas. The polls show that they are certainly tighter than we've had in years past. And so we're kind of buckling in for what we think will be the closest governor's race since 1994 in the state of Texas.
I want to come back to the border security issue. There's some news this past week. I think that I read that 2 million migrants had been stopped at America's southern border this year alone, which is a record. Is that an indication that border policies are working or that they're not working? If you're stopping 2 million people, doesn't that mean that 2 million folks didn't get across the border?
Yeah, the issues with the border are very complex and nuanced. So a lot of that 2 million is like what we're seeing is a surge of different kinds of migrants coming through that border that I don't think enough people are paying attention to. One of the things that we've seen is that there has been a dramatic rise in Cubans and Venezuelans who have come through that area. Now, remember, those are authoritarian governments that are making life even more miserable for those populations than we've seen in the past. So we're seeing this influx in Venezuelans. And so when they come across the border, they think that they have good asylum claims to make immediately. So those are legal asylum claims that once they get in, they want to be caught. They want to have that encounter with the Border Patrol. That's very different than some of the maybe, the Triangle countries and some Mexican, migrants who want to come work here and then go back. Those folks don't necessarily want to be caught. So the encounters, really have been really interesting to watch. There's a sector in Del Rio, Texas, that has been just overwhelmingly, the target for Venezuelans to come through. And I talked to Secretary Mayorkas, the Homeland Security Secretary, a couple of weeks ago on this issue. And he said, we're seeing something happening in the shift of migration from, what we used to think was a Mexican, transient type issue or the Triangle nations. It's now become much more of a South American and authoritarian government escape route is what's happening. And so it's changed the dynamics of how we talk about the border. And certainly everybody who's come across here is not the same. It's like we make a mistake when we think it's all one homogenous group of people who are all trying to do one thing. It's like it is as diverse as this globe is right now, and people are coming for very different reasons.
So is that changing the public perception of who is coming here and why? And as you noted, many of the people coming here now are coming to escape persecution, possible death, very, very poor economic circumstances, hunger, poverty are driving many of these people. Has the public perception, starting in Texas and then you can take it to the national level, change, or is it changing?
Yes and no. Okay, so the first part, I think there is an impact in terms of there's a different level of sympathy that we're seeing in some of the migrant, resource centers in places like San Antonio who are processing these people. I think, communities like that, understand that these Venezuelans are escaping something. They went through jungles to get here to try to, get away from prosecution. So that's one thing. But look, the sheer number of people coming across the borders still creating that same strain on those communities along the border. Places like Del Rio, Texas, and Laredo, they're not equipped to handle the surge that we're having. And so you still have that rooted concern of there's just too many people coming across and we can't care for them and we can't track them. And I think that kind of goes to that national discussion. When you see some of the conservative media that get frustrated with that number coming across, they're kind of amplifying that concern that somehow these folks coming across are just too much for the American people to handle. But there's good news on that front. We're seeing that Mexican and the Triangle countries, crossing over into Texas have been starting to decline a little bit and at least flatten out in other areas. And so we're seeing some improvement along there. Well, who knows what that looks like, by the time we hit election day and what kind of issues are popping up. But it seems like it's getting a little bit more controlled on some levels. But like we said, it's like there's a lot of different people coming through, from Venezuela and Cuba that's really escalating that. And I think they bring a different level of sympathy. When you talk to people in Florida, when you're escaping, Cuba and escaping Venezuela, you're looked at as with a lot more sympathy, I think, than a lot of other people who may be crossing, over into this country. Remember, it wasn't too long ago. If you were Cuban, you just had to set foot in this country and you were going to be on the path to citizenship. Yeah. The Venezuelans are facing much of the same kind of crisis back in their home country right now, but they're not being afforded that. And you're starting to hear people question, why are we shipping Venezuelans to places like Massachusetts or to Washington, D.C. or New York to handle when we have communities in places like Houston, Miami that have Venezuelan populations that could help these people assimilate into our country, in our states.
Jeremy, this is a hugely important conversation, and you just mentioned this recent example Florida and Texas seeming to cooperate actually in shipping some migrants who were, I think, from Venezuela to Martha's Vineyard, sort of a Tony Island off the coast of Massachusetts. It smelled here anyways, and we're in the Northeast where we taped the show. It smelled here as a little bit of a political stunt, but I'm wondering, how did it play in Texas with the people that you're talking to?
Well, what an interesting, turn of events on this. So on one level, it's funny because some of the community groups who are trying to help these migrants are kind of thankful that, people are providing transportation for these people free of charge to get to places like Washington, D.C. or to New York or even to Boston, if that was originally the intent. So there's some of those community advocacy groups who are helping these people are like, hey, this is kind of a good deal in some ways. But of course, that's not how the governors are approaching it. The governors are approaching it not because they want to help these migrants, move on. They want to use this as a way to pressure the Biden administration to do more on immigration. They want to pressure Kamala Harris. Governor Greg Abbott actually sent migrants, on a bus, again, normally Venezuelan, to the residence of Kamala Harris, which is far from any sort of resources or help that they would have needed, which just put more pressure on the system in D.C. to get those people to the places that they could get the help, where they could get food and housing and even, maybe employment and get their paperwork taken care of. So there's kind of a double edge to this thing, right? In one respect, they're kind of giving some assistance to some people, but the political show that they're kind of putting on, they know that plays big with their base loves this. The base of the Republican Party in both Texas and Florida are applauding Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis every time they do these things. And I think that is that positive reinforcement they're getting out of this as they both look to try to be national leaders on this topic.
So once again, Florida Governor DeSantis is in the national news and in the spotlight. And he has been, of course, for quite a long time. But recently, meaning the last several months, there has been increasing talk of him as being possibly a presidential candidate in 2024. And obviously, we still have former President Donald Trump out there as a possible candidate. What do you make of all that? I mean, the talk that you are hearing about DeSantis is growing. It seems like he's walking, in two different areas at once, trying to secure his future. And again, we don't have a crystal ball here, but what's your take on that in terms of him?
You cannot be governor of the state of Florida or the state of Texas or California without thinking that one day you're going to be president.
Well, and history shows that.
Yeah, they have already all rehearsed their acceptance speeches by now at some point in a mirror somewhere. But, that being said, I have no doubt Ron DeSantis, they know that there's a potential here if he can keep his national profile where it is. I think they know that he needs to keep striking now to keep his name out there. Remember, in politics, a year is a lifetime. Right. People who are already trying to coronate Ron DeSantis, I remind them, in 2006, we were all talking about how Rudy Giuliani had the nomination for presidency wrapped up. Remember, he was so super popular, but no, it's like he clearly never came close, and nobody saw Barack Obama coming. So it's a long way to go. So I would, hesitate to say Ron DeSantis is going to be the guy for sure. Iowa is a tough place to campaign, and I can guarantee you there'll be plenty of Texans running around in Iowa at the same time Ron DeSantis is, if President Trump is not running again for re-election.
Jeremy, I want to pivot a little bit, still keeping it at that national perspective, but President Biden earlier this summer made some news when he referred to followers of the Make America Great Again movement as semi-fascist. How did that play in Texas?
Poorly in the wrong spots, probably. Look, in the suburban areas that were already moving away from Trump, you saw it in all the, the post-election stuff in 2020, that look, Trump lost not only, suburban women, but he was starting to lose suburban men. So I think in those suburban areas, Biden and his team are kind of making a calculation that, look, those people have moved away from Trump. They're not going to go back to him. Let's make this case to them. But there's these really hardcore red areas that are probably Republican. I think of areas just outside of Houston and outside of Dallas that are pretty conservative Republican areas, people that voted for George W. Bush, but may not be Trump and may not be MAGA, but they may have voted for Trump. I know it's a complicated thing to get through. And so Biden risks alienating them for the people who kind of like, look, they vote Republican all the time. So if you're in these areas and you voted Republican for Trump over Hillary Clinton, are you evil in MAGA? Or are you something different? And I think that's there's a nuance there that I don't think Biden can address in that speech that kind of gave a little pushback. So I think the gains that Democrats were making in those areas, kind of get blunted a little if he's going to start, referring to everybody who voted for Trump as potentially a problem. Because those are real people. They live in the suburbs around Dallas and Houston. They're not bad people. Like not all of them who voted for Trump in 2016 are. And so you're like, how do you thread that needle? And I think, Biden's playing a dangerous game there of trying to win over suburban areas. But boy, in conservative areas, you just might lose a few people who you might have been able to swing over.
So let's look at the Senate. Again, bearing in mind that we're a few weeks out and no one has a crystal ball, what are the chances that the Republicans can regain control of the Senate? Both of your senators in the state of Texas, Cornyn and Cruz, are not up for re-election. So that isn't a factor really in Texas, but nationally, what are the chances? How are you pegging that?
I'm going to steal a line I heard from U.S. Senator Ted Cruz when I talked to him recently. He said, 60% chance of taking back the U.S. Senate still. I think that's a little high. I'm putting it more at 50-50. I think he was being optimistic because he really, really wants to be in the majority again. But, I think that's a tough climb because, look, a lot of people have made this, case already, but the candidate choices in Pennsylvania and Georgia are just tough choices. They have such a bigger uphill climb because of the candidates they picked on the Republican side to run in those races. And I think that just kind of really, throws a big curveball in this thing. And look, as a former Florida reporter, I'm never so sure where Florida's going to be. When you look at how many elections they've had that have been within 1%, every governor's race in Florida has been within 1% or 1.2% since 2006. It's close. Everything is close in Florida, and it could just come down to a rainstorm in Broward County, whether or not a guy like Marco Rubio could be in danger. We just don't know. That's why they campaign like crazy, because they know despite all the money and despite whatever the polls say, nothing is ever certain in Florida. You'll have a curveball thrown out there every now and then. And so I think that affects the entire national scheme, right? If Marco Rubio goes down, there's no hope of the Republicans taking back control of the United States Senate.
And what about the House races? What does your crystal ball show about that?
Well, there's a point where I thought Texas could have been a little bit more vulnerable, and adds to some of those races, but I don't think that's going to be the case anymore. I think Republicans, are in a very good position to regain control of the United States House. They've done an immaculate job of gerrymandering in ways that, you just, you almost have to tip your hat, even though it can be pretty evil stuff. But, it's like, look, they did what they needed to do in places like Florida and Texas to make sure they don't have any more leakage of Republican seats moving over to Democrats like we've seen in the last 4 years. So I think they've done enough to kind of protect themselves on that. And there's enough open seats to kind of work with it. I think they can get there. I don't think it's rock solid. I think the majority that they may gain out of this is going to be pretty small. I think as Joe Biden's approval numbers have improved and as inflation takes on a different kind of a feel, especially as gas prices come down, those issues really kind of affect, how, average regular voters are going to go vote. And I think, if they're not making this as much of a referendum on Joe Biden as we thought might be the case, that's good news for Democrats in at least keeping the majority in the House close. But boy, yeah, I would, if I had put money on this at this point, I'd definitely say the House is going to be Republican when we wake up on November 9th. And I think the Senate is probably going to hold, with the Democrats, unless the Republicans can figure out a way to, win that seat in Pennsylvania.
Interesting. One of the things that has been fascinating to me in American politics in the last couple of cycles are the inroads that Republicans have made with Spanish-speaking communities, particularly in the American Southeast. I'm curious if you've seen that, but I'm also curious if you are tracking or hearing about concerns about Spanish language disinformation coming up out of Central and South America, but beginning to manifest itself in Spanish language outlets in the American South.
Yeah, that very good questions on both those fronts. We've been looking at this a lot. It's like, really, in Texas, what we've seen along the Texas border, particularly in some of the more rural areas, the Hispanic populations there are showing a little bit more tendency to be willing to vote for some Republicans. Not all Republicans. Look, there are places like Laredo and Brownsville on the very tip of the Rio Grande Valley that are just gonna vote Democratic. There's almost no way that they're not. But we've seen a couple of counties that ended up like flipping over for the first time in 100 years. Smaller counties, but flipped over to vote for President Trump in the last election cycle. So he made some gains in those areas with Hispanic voters. Some of it is the Spanish language stuff. They did more on Spanish language, TV and radio. We're seeing that with Governor Greg Abbott in Texas right now. The guy has put a lot of money into Spanish language, outreach, which is so different from what we've seen, at least for the last few cycles in Texas. And Democrat Beto O'Rourke, though, is not going to let him just roam free there. So he's aggressively going at that. He knows Spanish really well. He holds full events in all Spanish. And so he has an advantage sometimes in being able to convey a message. Now, whether that message gets accepted is another thing altogether. As we've seen in places like Florida, that, like you mentioned, the misinformation that can be out there is hard to track and hard to, tamp down. It's like we haven't heard as much of that so far in on the border. I have my ears out. I've learned enough Spanish to understand when people are getting lied to. So we're trying to listen to that stuff and kind of keep tabs on it because that is going to be important. But there's one other huge caveat on that. There's a lot of focus on how the folks on the border are maybe more in play. And absolutely true. I think there's a little bit more competitive down there, and I could see the governor doing better down there than maybe in years past. But the predominant number of Hispanics in Texas are in places like Houston and San Antonio. Right. Houston has 1 million Hispanics, and they're voting bluer and bluer with each cycle. And San Antonio, which Republicans were just winning 8 years ago, is now so incredibly blue that there's no hope of them winning San Antonio this year.
Wow.
And that has a lot to do with what's happening on the ground in those areas where Hispanic voters, they are registering and they are going to vote in ways that we haven't seen in the state, going back 20, 30 years. So I think as much as there are gains by Republicans in some of those Hispanic areas in the rural communities and outside the Texas border, they're losing ground in big cities like San Antonio and Houston in big numbers. So that might offset whatever gains they think they're making in that valley area.
Jeremy, there are so many issues in play here during this election. It's hard to recall a similar election with so many, and we could do a separate show on all of them. I'd like to get your take on one, though, and the fact that the importance or lack of importance this will play in the election, and that is the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. Polls I've seen show that for a lot of people, this is a critical issue. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a bigger issue than people understand. I've spent a lot of time on the ground traveling in all kinds of places in Texas. I was in a little place called Muleshoe, Texas. It's a very conservative Republican area. And in that room, I kept hearing women between the ages of 18 and 20 saying, I am mad and I want to know how to vote. Show me how to vote. And so, wow. But then I saw that again in Dumas, Texas. Then I saw it again in Abilene, Texas. I think there's more of that going on, which I've seen with my own eyes, of young women particularly who are like, no way, we're not doing this, And so I think that kind of frustration is hard to kind of gain in polls. And so watch that younger voter, group, especially when we get into, post-election stuff. You're going to see a lot more younger women, active and voting in this election. And I think the Democrats are starting to kind of feel that wave. I think that's the kind of energy they needed if they were going to try to counteract. Is this race all about Joe Biden? No. For half the population, potentially, this is about more than, Joe Biden at this point. This is about that Supreme Court decision and how it's playing in some of the states. In some states, it's a much more aggressive result than, in others. In Texas, it literally has stopped anybody from being able to get an abortion, even in cases of rape and incest. That is going really extremely far for Texas voters. Polling shows most Texas voters don't agree with that. And so the Democrats have a lane to go on, and they now have a large amount of young women who I think particularly are leading this charge to do something about it. If they can harness that, you can see how we could be sitting there on November 9th with the Democrats having pulled off something they haven't done in 30 years in Texas, which is winning the governor's race.
Jeremy, do you see them having that kind of traction? We got about 10 seconds left here.
I think it does. I think it has a lot. It's like, I think the more I talk to young voters in different parts of the state, it cuts across all areas. It's not just liberal areas that this is happening in. Even in conservative areas, we have, people saying, look, it's like, this is too much and this is going to motivate them. I think it's far more motivating than polls are picking up right now.
That's remarkable. Jeremy, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. He's Jeremy Wallace with the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News. That is all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.